In the late 19th century, the relationship between the Russian Empire and global financial houses remained a precarious landscape of conditional engagement. The eruption of the Kishinev pogrom on Easter Sunday fundamentally severed these remaining ties, transforming localized religious violence into a definitive catalyst for a worldwide credit blockade. Orchestrated by agitators and fueled by the anti-Semitic publication Basarabets, the massacre resulted in 49 deaths and the destruction of approximately 2,500 Jewish homes and businesses. These events were not viewed by international observers as organic civil unrest, but as state-sanctioned administrative planning aimed at internal marginalization. The subsequent indifference of the Tsarist government and the refusal of Interior Minister Vyacheslav von Plehve to intervene acted as a double-edged sword, signaling to the Western world that the Romanovs were no longer reliable sovereign partners. In New York, Jacob Schiff of Kuhn, Loeb & Co. recognized this as an existential physical threat to his kin and a violation of the royal sanctuary traditionally expected from a central authority. This political overreach and the intense social instability it created provided the necessary conditions for a coordinated financial pivot. Jewish financiers in the City of London and Wall Street transitioned from passive observers to active participants in a meticulously managed effort to freeze Russian access to liquid capital. This era established a legal and fiscal control over the Tsar's borrowing power, as Schiff and his peers began to view the Russian treasury as a commercial vacuum to be deprived of essential lubrication. By 1904, the blood libel and physical violence of Kishinev had been successfully weaponized into a powerful economic instrument, ensuring that the financial architecture of the upcoming war would be built specifically to facilitate the autocracy's exhaustion. The Pale of Settlement functioned as a vast demographic containment zone, legally confining over 5 million subjects to the empire's western borderlands. Established by Catherine the Great and rigorously tightened by successive May laws, this administrative territory barred Jewish residency in the Russian interior, effectively creating a structural economic bottleneck. By 1904, the region's saturation had triggered a collapse in local commerce, as millions were restricted to a narrow range of permissible trades and prohibited from owning agricultural land. This coerced urbanization into overcrowded shtetls produced a surplus of labor and a deficit of capital, leaving the population in a state of terminal insolvency. The legal framework of the Pale imposed a system of procedural safeguards for the state that functioned as a direct impost on the minority's survival. Jews faced double taxation while being excluded from state service, the officer corps, and the rural peasantry. This geographic and professional segregation was coupled with strict educational quotas, or numerous clauses, which ensured that intellectual capital remained stagnant. For the emerging financial elite in the West, the Pale was no longer merely a domestic Russian concern, but a transnational liability that demanded a systemic external response. This environment of managed deprivation turned the Russian Jewish population into a captive market of suffering, one that required the strategic deployment of liquid assets from abroad. International relief organizations and financiers recognized that internal migration to the continental United States or Western Europe was the only relief for this demographic pressure. The necessity of financing this mass exodus, combined with a desire to dismantle the legal barriers of the Pale, provided a primary economic motive for challenging the Romanovs' fiscal sovereignty. By targeting the Tsar's borrowing power, global finance sought to leverage the state's desperation to force an administrative reorientation of its western provinces. Jacob Schiff's transition from a neutral arbiter of capital to an active economic combatant was formalized through a categorical refusal to underwrite Russian sovereign debt. As the senior partner of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., Schiff commanded a significant portion of New York's investment capacity, which he leveraged to institute a total credit embargo against the Romanov dynasty. This policy was not merely a personal gesture, but a calculated disruption of the global underwriting syndicates that had historically sustained the Russian treasury. Schiff utilized his position on Wall Street to issue a formal directive to his partners and subordinates. Not a single dollar of Kuhn, Loeb capital, nor any issue they managed would be permitted to facilitate the fiscal requirements of the Russian state. The strategy focused on transforming Russia's enemy of mankind status into a quantifiable financial risk that Western markets could no longer ignore. By characterizing the Tsarist regime as an inherently unstable and morally bankrupt borrower, Schiff successfully discouraged other major New York houses from participating in Russian bond offerings. This isolation was further reinforced through intense diplomatic lobbying in Washington, D.C., where Schiff advocated for a foreign policy that reflected the financial sector's hostility toward St. Petersburg. The result was the closure of the American capital market to the Tsar, forcing the Russian finance ministry to rely on increasingly expensive and short-term credit facilities in Paris and Berlin. Economically, Schiff's vow created a liquidity wall that anticipated the massive specie requirements of a modern industrialized conflict. By preemptively denying the Tsar access to the New York market, he ensured that Russia entered 1904 with a depleted reserve of flexible capital. This systematic withdrawal of support functioned as the first stage of a financial pincer movement, designed to exacerbate the internal fiscal contradictions of an autocracy that spent millions on military expansion while its domestic economy remained stagnant. The vows signaled to the global financial community that the Romanovs were no longer a protected class of sovereign debtors, but a target for strategic disinvestment. The Russian Empire's fiscal architecture in 1904 was characterized by a fundamental imbalance between imperial ambition and available liquidity. While the Romanovs maintained a formidable military presence, the state's internal capital formation was insufficient to underwrite the rapid mobilization required for a modern, industrialized conflict in the Far East. The Tsarist treasury operated on a gold standard adopted in 1897, but its metallic reserves were largely static, functioning more as a psychological anchor for the ruble than a flexible war chest. Consequently, the government remained tethered to an external credit apparatus that it could neither control nor bypass. This reliance on international borrowing created a strategic vacuum when the traditional conduits of capital began to constrict. Russia's domestic banking sector lacked the depth to absorb large-scale sovereign bond issues, and the empire's long-distance logistical projects, such as the Trans-Siberian Railway, had already drained significant portions of the national budget. The state functioned as a rigid feudal hierarchy attempting to compete in a globalized market where speed of capital was as decisive as the speed of naval vessels. Without the participation of the major Jewish banking syndicates, which controlled the primary international exchange mechanisms and arbitrage networks, the Tsar's financial machinery effectively stalled. The absence of these specialized facilitators meant that Russia lost access to the sophisticated debt structuring techniques essential for wartime finance. While the state could levy arbitrary taxes on its peasantry, it possessed no facility for translating that localized agrarian wealth into the international bullion necessary for foreign procurement. This professional void left the finance ministry vulnerable to the strategic disinvestment orchestrated from New York and London. By late 1904, the Romanovs were forced into a precarious dependency on a narrow group of French lenders, creating a fiscal bottleneck that ensured the empire's military ventures were perpetually underfunded and economically isolated. The consolidation of the Wall Street-London axis represented an unprecedented unification of global capital against a specific sovereign entity. Jacob Schiff coordinated this transatlantic embargo through close collaboration with Sir Ernest Cassel and the House of Monsieur Samuel and Couver, ensuring that the primary credit markets of the English-speaking world functioned as a singular, impenetrable barrier to Russian borrowing. This coordination was not merely a shared sentiment, but a technical synchronization of underwriting schedules and interest rate benchmarks. By aligning the policies of the New York and London bourses, the Axis successfully converted Russia's credit rating into a national security liability for any firm considering a deviation from the boycott. The efficacy of this blockade rested on the control of the sterling-based international payment systems. Since the City of London remained the global clearinghouse for large-scale bullion transfers, Schiff's alliance with British financiers effectively barred the Tsar from accessing the specie necessary to stabilize the ruble during wartime inflation. This fiscal isolation was reinforced by a synchronized disinvestment strategy. As New York shut its doors, London's merchant banks simultaneously tightened their terms for Russian commercial paper, driving St. Petersburg's cost of capital to unsustainable levels. The resulting specie drought prevented the Russian finance ministry from leveraging its French alliances, as the French ruble-denominated holdings could not be easily converted into the neutral currency liquidity required for Pacific naval expenditures. Furthermore, this axis utilized its joint media and political influence to frame any potential Russian loan as a high-risk gamble on a failing autocracy. The coordinated dissemination of Russian fiscal deficits through the London Times and New York's financial dailies eroded the confidence of retail investors and smaller continental houses. This strategic communication ensured that even when Russia attempted to bypass the major firms, the broader market demand remained paralyzed. By 1904, the Wall Street-London axis had achieved a total market sterilization regarding the Romanovs, transforming the world's most powerful empire into a financial pariah before the first shots were fired at Port Arthur. In April 1904, the convergence of Japanese military necessity and American financial strategy was catalyzed during an encounter at the Hotel Metropole in London. Takahashi Korekiyo, vice governor of the Bank of Japan, had arrived in the British capital with the objective of securing a $10 million sovereign loan to sustain the opening stages of the conflict. While the British banking syndicate, comprised of Pars Bank, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, and the Chartered Bank, had agreed to underwrite $5 million, a critical capital shortfall remained. This deficit threatened to halt Japanese naval procurement and logistics before the imperial forces could establish a decisive advantage in the Pacific. The resolution of this fiscal crisis occurred during a dinner hosted by Arthur Sassoon, where Takahashi was introduced to Jacob Schiff. Schiff's presence in London was not incidental. He was actively seeking a viable mechanism to operationalize his embargo against the Russian state. Upon reviewing Japan's economic data and the proposed terms of the debt, Schiff committed Kuhn, Loeb, and Carr to underwriting the remaining $5 million. This agreement marked the first significant entry of United States capital into a major international war effort, effectively breaking the European monopoly on high-level sovereign lending. The financial instrument utilized for this transaction was a 6% sterling bond, meticulously structured to mitigate risk through the pledging of Japanese customs revenues as primary collateral. This legal charge on imperial trade ensured that the debt was serviced directly from Japan's commercial throughput, independent of the volatile military theater. By securing this New York-based tranche, Takahashi achieved a capital equilibrium that allowed Japan to compete with the Romanovs' deeper, albeit less accessible, reserves. The meeting at the Metropole transformed Japan from a high-risk regional actor into a creditworthy instrument of Western financial policy, providing the liquid bullion necessary to challenge an established European power on equal fiscal footing. The Meiji state in 1904 functioned as an emerging industrial entity that had not yet established a verifiable credit history within the global capital markets. While the abolition of the samurai class and the centralized land tax reform of 1873 provided a foundational internal revenue stream, these domestic fiscal measures were insufficient to sustain a capital-intensive conflict against a first-tier European power. The Japanese economy operated under a gold standard adopted only 7 years prior, and its metallic reserves were dangerously thin, representing a minute fraction of the bullion held by the Russian State Bank. Facing a projected war expenditure of over 1.7 billion yen, an amount nearly 7 times the national budget, the imperial government confronted a terminal liquidity crisis. This fiscal vulnerability was exacerbated by the lack of an established presence in the New York or London bourses, where sovereign risk was assessed with rigid skepticism toward non-Western actors. Japan's domestic market had been exhausted by voluntary patriotic bond drives, which failed to generate the international specie required for the procurement of British-built battleships and German artillery. The state was a nascent machinery of war that possessed the administrative discipline for mobilization but lacked the transnational financial conduits to fund it. Consequently, the Romanovs' strategy of financial attrition was grounded in the factual reality that Japan's gold reserves would be depleted within 6 months of active naval operations. The necessity for a foreign financial architecture was absolute. Without a massive infusion of sterling or dollars, the Imperial Navy would be rendered immobile due to the inability to service coal and munitions contracts. Takahashi Korekiyo's mission to the West was therefore a desperate search for a financial sponsor willing to overlook the absence of traditional credit metrics. The structural desperation of the Japanese treasury forced the state to offer unprecedented concessions, including the direct pledging of sovereign customs receipts as a mandatory guarantee of debt service. This total dependency on external underwriting transformed the Pacific conflict from a localized territorial dispute into a high-stakes experiment in international risk management. Jacob Schiff's decision to underwrite the first Japanese war loan was regarded by the established Protestant financial elite of New York as a catastrophic departure from prudent investment standards. The major Wall Street houses, dominated by the J.P. Morgan interests and often referred to as the Norman Baronage for their dynastic control over American industry, maintained a consensus that Japan was a fundamentally insolvent borrower. The prevailing market sentiment held that an Asian island nation, lacking established industrial infrastructure and possessing negligible gold reserves, could not survive a protracted war of attrition against the massive resources of the Russian Empire. To these observers, Schiff was not just risking Kuhn, Loeb's capital. He was placing the firm's reputation on a suicidal gamble that threatened to discredit Jewish-led investment houses in the global market. The skepticism was rooted in the quantifiable disparity between the belligerents' metallic assets. The Russian state bank held over $100 million in gold, while the Japanese specie reserve had plummeted below $10 million by the spring of 1904. Critics argued that Japanese military victories, such as the initial engagement at Port Arthur, were irrelevant to the underlying fiscal reality. Japan was burning capital at a rate that would necessitate a sovereign default within months. For Schiff, however, the risk was assessed through a different analytical lens. He viewed the loan not as a traditional commercial venture, but as a strategic equity stake in the destruction of an autocracy that had frozen out global Jewish capital. By committing Kuhn, Loeb, to half of the $10 million sterling issue, Schiff effectively bypassed the conservative credit wall of the New York establishment. He leveraged his firm's internal liquidity to guarantee a transaction that most American banks refused to touch without federal indemnification. This bold deployment of private capital signaled a fundamental shift in the American financial hierarchy, demonstrating that specialized high-conviction syndicates could override the collective caution of the Norman banking class. Schiff's great risk transformed Japan from a fiscal pariah into a subsidized agent of Western financial policy, proving that ideological alignment could occasionally serve as a more decisive underwriting metric than historical credit ratings. For Jacob Schiff, the decision to capitalize the Japanese war effort was fundamentally rooted in the strategic application of financial pressure to induce the systemic collapse of the Romanov autocracy. His primary objective transcended the standard metrics of yield or commission. He sought to weaponize international specie to precipitate a terminal fiscal crisis within the Russian Empire. Schiff calculated that the Tsarist government's dependence on external credit was its most profound vulnerability, and that by providing Japan with the liquid bullion necessary for modern naval operations, he could force Russia into an unsustainable race toward bankruptcy. This doctrine of revenge via specie viewed the Far Eastern conflict as a mechanism to punish the Russian state for its managed internal violence and the restrictive laws of the Pale. The economic logic of this intervention rested on the principle of financial exhaustion. Schiff understood that Russia's gold standard remained tethered to a fragile confidence in the ruble's convertibility. By flooding the theater of war with Japanese capital, enabling the blockade of Russian ports, and the destruction of the Baltic Fleet, Schiff ensured that the Tsar's war expenditures would far outstrip the empire's internal tax revenue. This created a structural deficit that forced the Russian finance ministry to liquidate its own metallic reserves to maintain the stability of its currency. For Schiff, every £1,000,000 sterling advanced to Japan functioned as a direct impost on the Romanovs' longevity, systematically draining the Tsarist treasury of its most vital administrative lubricant. Ultimately, Schiff's strategy aimed at the total fiscal sterilization of the Russian regime. He recognized that military defeat would be the immediate catalyst for domestic unrest, but that the absence of capital would be the final instrument of political disintegration. By orchestrating a global disinvestment campaign while simultaneously underwriting Russia's primary adversary, he created a financial pincer designed to leave the Tsar with no alternative but capitulation or revolution. This intervention demonstrated that in the 20th century global economy, the control of transnational credit networks could be utilized as a decisive tool for statecraft, capable of challenging the sovereignty of a traditional land empire through the cold application of financial attrition. The syndication of the Japanese war loan was executed through a highly integrated network of transnational familial and professional alliances, designed to distribute unprecedented sovereign risk across the primary financial hubs of the West. Jacob Schiff did not act as a solitary underwriter, but rather as the architect of a synchronized credit offensive, mobilizing a web of Jewish-led firms to absorb the $5 million New York tranche. This secondary distribution was essential because no single American house possessed the internal reserves to carry such a volatile asset without risking a liquidity crisis. By fracturing the loan into smaller, manageable blocks, Schiff ensured that the suicidal gamble was shared among a consortium of partners who prioritized geopolitical objectives alongside commercial returns. The technical core of this syndicate rested on the Warburg-Schiff-Castle axis, which utilized long-standing interfamily ties to bypass traditional banking gatekeepers. In Frankfurt, the Warburg and Cumberland House coordinated the German absorption of Japanese debt, while in London, Sir Ernest Cassel leveraged his proximity to the British Crown to reinforce the Pars Bank syndicate. This arrangement ensured that the capital flowed through a closed circuit of trusted intermediaries, preventing the Romanovs from utilizing their own agents to sabotage the bond's pricing. The syndication process utilized bipartite indentures and standardized legal frameworks that rendered Japanese credit transparent to Western investors, even as the military outcome remained uncertain. Economically, this familial machinery functioned as a private central bank for the Meiji state. By successfully placing these bonds in the portfolios of thousands of retail and institutional investors, the syndicate created a broad-based vested interest in a Russian defeat. The risk was systematically offloaded from Kuhn, Loeb, and Kobier's balance sheet onto the wider market, providing Schiff with the revolving credit necessary to fund subsequent Japanese loans. This sophisticated distribution of risk transformed a localized Pacific conflict into a global financial mandate, proving that a coordinated minority network could effectively underwrite the sovereignty of a foreign nation against the interests of a traditional land empire. The issuance of the sterling bond in May 1904 served as the definitive technical pivot that enabled Japan to bypass the ruble's domestic dominance and access the global liquidity of the gold standard. By denominating the debt in British pounds rather than the Japanese yen, Takahashi Korekiyo and Jacob Schiff created a neutral currency barrier that protected Western investors from the internal inflationary pressures of the Japanese wartime economy. This instrument functioned as a sophisticated bridge of capital, where the value of the principal and interest was fixed against the world's primary reserve currency, ensuring that the lenders kept one half of the legal security while the liquid bullion flowed toward Pacific naval procurement. The structure of the $10 million loan was divided into two equal tranches of $5 million, split between London and New York, a strategy designed to diversify the geographic risk and maximize the available pool of specie. The bond carried a 6% coupon and was issued at a discount price of 93.5, providing an immediate and substantial yield that incentivized participation despite the suicidal military outlook. Crucially, the indenture included a mandatory first charge on the Imperial Japanese customs revenues. This legal mechanism transformed the bond into a self-liquidating asset. As Japan's international trade continued, the customs receipts were collected in hard currency and channeled into dedicated escrow accounts, bypassing the Japanese General Treasury entirely. This financial architecture effectively weaponized Japan's commercial throughput against the Russian Empire's static reserves. While the capital was utilized to pay for British-built warships and coal, the rigid repayment structure signaled to the global markets that Japan had accepted procedural safeguards that prioritized debt service over domestic social spending. The sterling bond did not merely provide money, it integrated Japan into the Anglo-American financial axis, establishing a symbiotic relationship where the survival of the Meiji state became a mandatory requirement for the stability of Western investment portfolios. By late 1904, this instrument had successfully liquidated the Tsar's competitive advantage, proving that a mobile, sterling-backed debt could outmaneuver the stagnant gold of an autocracy. The leverage of advanced credit instruments enabled the Japanese state to bypass the massive but static gold reserves of the Russian Empire, creating a financial speed and flexibility that the Romanov autocracy could not replicate. While Russia relied on a fortress of gold policy, hoarding bullion in St. Petersburg to maintain ruble stability, the Japanese treasury, guided by Korekiyo Takahashi and Jacob Schiff, utilized the revolving credit mechanisms of the London and New York money markets. These instruments allowed Japan to spend capital it had not yet physically collected, effectively monetizing its future customs revenues and internal tax receipts through the issuance of short-term treasury bills and anticipation notes. The technical core of this strategy was the utilization of arbitrage networks and bill of exchange systems. Since Japan was integrated into the Anglo-American financial axis, it could settle munitions and naval contracts in London using credits established in New York, without the physical movement of specie across the Pacific. This created a velocity of capital that functioned as a force multiplier. A single £1,000,000 could be leveraged multiple times through the London clearinghouses to secure coal, steel, and gunpowder simultaneously. In contrast, the Russian treasury was forced to move physical gold or negotiate cumbersome, high-interest ruble loans in Paris that were often tied to specific diplomatic or military contingencies. Furthermore, the syndicate utilized contingent credit lines, early forms of standby underwriting, that ensured Japan could sustain its naval blockade even if a specific battle resulted in heavy losses. These instruments were secured not by current assets, but by legal charges on the economic throughput of the Meiji state. By transforming the sovereignty of Japan into a series of quantifiable, tradable securities, the Wall Street-London axis created a synthetic reserve that effectively neutralized the Tsar's competitive advantage in raw bullion. By late 1904, the sophisticated machinery of Western finance had outpaced the medieval hoarding of the Romanovs, proving that in a globalized economy, the ability to manipulate credit was superior to the possession of unspent gold. The catalytic function of the Japanese war loans was most visible in the rapid procurement and maintenance of the Imperial Japanese Navy's frontline capital ships. Unlike the Russian Baltic Fleet, which relied on state-owned shipyards and domestic industrial output, the Japanese naval expansion was almost entirely dependent on foreign shipbuilders, specifically the yards of Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth in the United Kingdom. These private contracts required immediate, massive outlays of gold and silver to satisfy the rigid payment schedules of British industry. The capital raised by Jacob Schiff and the Kuhn, Loeb's syndicate provided the specific international liquidity needed to ensure that battleships like the Mikasa were not only delivered, but maintained with the highest grade of Cardiff coal and specialized munitions. The financial architecture of the loans acted as a direct subsidy for Japanese naval readiness. While the Russian Navy struggled with decentralized funding and bureaucratic delays, the Japanese utilized their sterling-denominated credits to secure long-term munitions contracts that guaranteed a steady supply of explosive shells and replacement parts. This ensured that Japan's 6.6 fleet, 6 battleships, and 6 armored cruisers could operate at peak efficiency throughout the conflict. The loans effectively monetized the future sovereignty of Japan to buy the physical instruments of sea power in the present, transforming liquid bullion into armor plate and long-range artillery. Economically, this procurement process integrated the Japanese military effort into the British industrial financial complex. By settling naval accounts in London with capital raised in New York, Japan bypassed the logistical bottleneck of moving physical specie across the Pacific. This just-in-time financial mobilization allowed the Japanese to replenish their munitions reserves after the heavy expenditures at Port Arthur and the Yellow Sea. By 1905, the underwritten strength of the Imperial Navy had rendered the Tsar's superior numbers irrelevant, proving that the strategic deployment of catalytic capital was as decisive as tactical maneuvers on the high seas. The strategic destabilization of the secondary market for Russian sovereign debt functioned as a primary mechanism to restrict the Tsar's ability to refinance existing obligations during the 1904 conflict. Jacob Schiff orchestrated this campaign by leveraging the reputational weight of Kuhn, Loeb & Co. to systematically erode the market value of Russian bonds on the bourses of Berlin, Amsterdam, and London. This was not a localized protest, but a technical assault on the convertibility narrative that the Russian finance ministry used to attract continental capital. By coordinating a synchronized withdrawal of support from major market makers, Schiff ensured that whenever the Russian treasury attempted to float new paper, the outstanding bonds would undergo sharp price depreciations, effectively raising the yield and therefore the cost of all future borrowing. The manipulation utilized the financial press as a tool for market sterilization, disseminating detailed reports on Russia's internal unrest and the depletion of its domestic gold cover. Schiff's influence ensured that influential journals in Frankfurt and New York emphasized the structural insolvency of the Romanov state, characterizing Russian 4% bonds as speculative assets rather than conservative savings vehicles. This strategic communication successfully discouraged the Norman retail investor base in Europe, which had traditionally viewed the Tsar as a stable, land-backed debtor. As secondary market prices fell below par, the Russian treasury was forced to utilize its own dwindling metallic reserves to intervene and prop up bond prices, a move that further exacerbated the state's liquidity crisis. By 1905, this coordinated disinvestment had decoupled Russian credit from traditional European benchmarks. The Schiff-led boycott transformed the Paris Bourse into Russia's only remaining venue for credit. Yet even there, the cost of capital was driven upward by the visible failure of Russian bonds in neutral markets. This secondary market pressure functioned as a fiscal cage, preventing the Tsar from leveraging his vast land assets into the liquid bullion required for the war. The resulting yield spike proved that in an interconnected global market, the active hostility of a major investment house could effectively paralyze the credit of a traditional empire, regardless of its physical military strength. The maintenance of the financial embargo required a sophisticated intelligence network capable of monitoring the Russian state bank's actual metallic reserves in real time. Jacob Schiff utilized a decentralized array of informants, including disenchanted clerks within the Russian finance ministry and commercial agents embedded in the continental bourses, to track the Tsar's dwindling gold supplies. This information apparatus functioned as a shadow audit, providing Kuhn, Loeb, and Kossis with precise data on the velocity of depletion affecting the St. Petersburg treasury. By 1904, this network had successfully penetrated the official accounting of the Romanov state, revealing that the fortress of gold was being hollowed out by the dual pressures of naval procurement and the maintenance of internal liquidity. The technical efficacy of this network rested on the monitoring of gold movements through the major clearinghouses of Paris and Berlin. Just as the Sassoons utilized compradors to gauge Chinese market demand, Schiff relied on specialized bullion brokers who recorded the arrival and departure of Russian gold bars. These brokers provided evidence that the Tsar was being forced to pledge physical bullion as collateral for short-term French credits, a sign of extreme fiscal desperation. This intelligence allowed Schiff to time his Japanese bond offerings with surgical precision, launching new credit tranches at the exact moments when Russian reserves reached critical lows, thereby maximizing the psychological impact on global investor confidence. Furthermore, this network tracked the unrecorded liabilities of the Russian government, specifically the massive subsidies required to suppress domestic agrarian unrest and revolutionary strikes. By correlating the cost of internal pacification with the expenditures of the Pacific War, Schiff's agents provided a comprehensive map of the Romanovs' path to insolvency. This data was utilized to verify the irreversibility of decline, ensuring that the Wall Street-London axis remained committed to the boycott. By 1905, the information network had transformed the Tsar's private ledgers into public knowledge, proving that an empire's traditional secrecy could be systematically dismantled by a coordinated financial intelligence operation. As the external credit embargo tightened, the Russian finance ministry attempted to bridge the growing fiscal deficit by imposing an internal talage on its domestic population. This effort was characterized by a series of extraordinary excise taxes on basic commodities, specifically vodka, sugar, and matches, which were intended to generate the immediate ruble liquidity required to sustain the Manchurian campaign. However, this administrative maneuver failed to account for the structural weakness of the Russian agrarian economy, which was already suffering from the terminal insolvency of the peasantry. The attempt to extract liquid wealth from a subsistence-based population proved mathematically impossible. While the state increased the tax rates, the actual collection volume remained stagnant, as the rural population simply exited the cash economy. The technical failure of this internal levy was exacerbated by the rapid devaluation of the ruble. Since the Tsar could no longer defend the gold standard through international borrowing, the domestic currency began to lose purchasing power against the pound sterling and the dollar, inflating the cost of the very munitions and armor the state sought to procure. The fortress of gold remained physically intact in the vaults of St. Petersburg, but its utility as a collateral base was effectively neutralized because the internal economy was too devalued to provide a secondary line of credit. The state found itself in a fiscal pincer. It could not borrow from abroad due to the Wall Street-London axis, and it could not tax at home because the population possessed no liquid surplus to surrender. By late 1904, the imposition of these punitive taxes had become a primary driver of domestic social instability. The peasantry, already radicalized by the famine of 1901, viewed the war talage as an illegitimate seizure of their survival assets. This created a secondary unrecorded liability for the state, as the cost of mobilizing internal security forces to collect delinquent taxes began to exceed the revenue generated by the taxes themselves. The Tsar's attempt to fund a 20th century naval war through 19th century feudal extraction resulted in a structural economic paralysis, confirming Schiff's calculation that financial exhaustion would precede military collapse. The French branch of the Rothschild family occupied a precarious position as the primary underwriters of Russian sovereign debt during the diplomatic consolidation of the dual alliance. By 1904, the French market was heavily exposed to the Romanov treasury, with billions of francs in ruble-denominated bonds held by small-scale French retail investors. This established a structural dependency where the solvency of the Russian state was inextricably linked to the stability of the French financial system. The Rothschilds faced a profound moral and operational dilemma: to honor their role as the fiscal guardians of the French-Russian military pact, or to align with the global Jewish boycott spearheaded by Jacob Schiff in response to the state-sanctioned violence of Kishinev. Historically, the House of Rothschild had utilized its capital to influence Russian policy, notably withdrawing from an 1891 loan to protest the expulsion of Jews from Moscow. However, the geopolitical landscape of the early 20th century imposed new constraints, as the French government viewed Russian credit as a mandatory component of national security against German expansion. This created an asymmetrical pressure. While Schiff could operate with the relative ideological freedom of a New York private banker, the Paris Rothschilds were bound by the quid pro quo of the Quai d'Orsay. Consequently, they adopted a policy of managed neutrality, refusing to lead new war syndicates while simultaneously managing the interest payments on existing debt to prevent a catastrophic default that would ruin French bondholders. This strategic hesitation effectively neutralized Paris as a source of fresh war specie for the Tsar. While the Rothschilds did not actively capitalize the Japanese effort, their refusal to underwrite new Russian tranches during the height of the Pacific conflict signaled to the continental markets that the Romanovs were no longer a protected class of debtors. This passive resistance functioned as a vital component of the broader financial blockade, ensuring that even Russia's most loyal ally remained a site of capital stagnation. By 1905, the French Rothschilds had successfully prioritized their long-term communal interests over short-term diplomatic loyalty, proving that the withdrawal of high-level underwriting could be as decisive as the provision of active credit. The closure of the Berlin market represented a critical failure in the Russian finance ministry's attempts to diversify its credit sources beyond the Paris Bourse. Historically, the House of Mendelssohn and Comer had served as the primary German conduit for Tsarist debt, maintaining a stable flow of capital from Berlin to St. Petersburg since the mid-19th century. Jacob Schiff recognized that neutralizing this German connection was essential to achieving total fiscal isolation for the Romanovs. Leveraging his deep-seated influence within the Frankfurt banking community and his partnership with Warburg & Co., Schiff orchestrated a coordinated defection of German financiers. He framed the continued underwriting of Russian bonds not merely as a moral liability, but as an objective financial hazard given the empire's deteriorating domestic stability. The technical mechanism of this defection involved the threat of exclusion from the more lucrative American and British underwriting syndicates. Schiff made it explicitly clear to German houses that participation in Russian war loans would disqualify them from future Japanese issues and high-yield American industrial projects handled by Kuhn, Loeb, and Kopaplos. This created a binary choice for Berlin's bankers: maintain a stagnant relationship with a declining autocracy, or join the ascendant Anglo-American financial axis. Consequently, major German institutions began to prioritize their New York-based revolving credit over their traditional ruble-denominated holdings. By late 1904, the Berlin market had effectively ceased to function as a viable venue for Russian sovereign debt, leaving the Tsar's treasury without its most reliable continental counterweight. This disinvestment forced the Russian government to accept increasingly punitive terms from the few remaining secondary lenders. The Berlin defection ensured that any capital reaching St. Petersburg from Germany arrived via expensive short-term commercial bills rather than long-term stabilized bonds. This professional abandonment confirmed that the Romanovs had lost their most favored borrower status in Central Europe. By 1905, the strategic pressure applied by Schiff had successfully reduced the Russian fiscal machinery to a single, overexposed link in Paris, fulfilling the primary requirement for total financial exhaustion. The maintenance of Japanese credit during the 1904 conflict depended on the institutionalization of an internal fiscal discipline known as the ARCA system, designed to guarantee absolute transparency to international lenders. While the Russian treasury operated behind a veil of traditional imperial secrecy, the Japanese finance ministry, under the direction of Takahashi Korekiyo, adopted a policy of total administrative accountability. This framework ensured that every yen derived from the foreign war loans was recorded, centrally controlled, and earmarked for specific, pre-authorized naval and military expenditures. This rigorous oversight functioned as a triple-locked security for the Schiff-led syndicate, providing the verifiable data necessary to sustain investor confidence in the Meiji state's survival. The technical core of this system was the separation of the war budget from the general imperial accounts, creating a segregated capital pool that could not be diverted for domestic social projects or civil administration. This administrative firewall was reinforced by a dual auditing process involving both the Bank of Japan and representatives from the Western banking consortiums. By allowing London and New York underwriters to verify the burn rate of Japanese capital, Takahashi neutralized the skepticism of the global bourses. This transparency transformed Japanese sovereign risk into a quantifiable commercial metric, distinguishing the Meiji state from the Romanov autocracy, whose opaque financial management was increasingly viewed as a precursor to default. Furthermore, this system mandated that the interest payments on the sterling bonds be prioritized as a senior obligation over all other national expenditures. The customs revenues pledged as collateral were channeled directly into dedicated escrow accounts, ensuring that the debt service remained independent of the volatility of the Manchurian theater. This locked financial architecture effectively immunized Japanese credit against the psychological impact of temporary military setbacks. By 1905, the ARCA system had established a new global standard for wartime finance, proving that a nascent power could maintain the highest credit rating by surrendering fiscal autonomy to its international creditors in exchange for the liquid bullion of victory. The completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway during the conflict created a logistical and financial burden that fundamentally destabilized the Russian imperial budget. While the line provided a singular, land-based conduit for troop movements to Manchuria, its operational costs were astronomical, exceeding 500 million rubles in emergency maintenance and fuel procurement. The single-track bottleneck at Lake Baikal required a massive deployment of ice-breaking ferries and temporary sled track infrastructure, all of which demanded immediate, liquid capital that the Tsarist treasury could not generate through traditional borrowing. This logistical nightmare forced the state to divert its remaining metallic reserves from naval modernization to the simple sustenance of its overland supply chain. To fund this relentless drain of specie, the Finance Ministry intensified its domestic debt collection through a system of ruthless agrarian seizures. Special commissions were dispatched to the rural provinces to enforce the collection of tax arrears that had accumulated since the 1891 famine, utilizing the military to sequester grain, livestock, and tools from the peasantry. This internal extraction functioned as a predatory impost on the empire's own primary producers as the state sought to convert the physical assets of the village communes into the international bullion required for rail logistics. The process was formalized by administrative decrees that prioritized war levies over manorial protections, effectively liquidating the survival reserves of the Russian interior. This punitive fiscal policy resulted in a terminal erosion of the state's domestic legitimacy. As the cost of the Trans-Siberian rose, the velocity of internal wealth destruction accelerated, leaving the rural population in a state of managed starvation. The Tsar's reliance on coercive collection agents to finance a modern industrial railroad created a structural contradiction. The state was perfecting its ability to move troops while simultaneously destroying the economic base that sustained them. By 1905, the logistical miracle of the railway had become the primary engine of Russia's internal bankruptcy, fulfilling Schiff's prediction. that the autocracy's own machinery of power would eventually consume its financial foundations. The surrender of the Port Arthur fortress in January 1905 functioned as the definitive technical pivot where military attrition translated into total fiscal paralysis. Beyond the loss of the Pacific Squadron, the capitulation signaled the obsolescence of the Romanovs' land-based collateral. International credit markets, particularly the Paris Bourse, responded with a fundamental reassessment of Russian solvency, causing the spread between Russian 4% bonds and neutral benchmarks to widen to unprecedented margins. This was the moment the state's credit mechanisms began to seize, as the French banking consortiums, led by Crédit Lyonnais, realized that no volume of stored bullion could compensate for a terminal loss of strategic initiative. The funding moratorium manifested in the immediate inability of the Russian finance ministry to roll over short-term treasury bills in continental markets. Lenders who had previously accepted ruble-denominated paper now demanded exorbitant risk premiums, effectively pricing the Tsar out of the very markets that had sustained his industrialization. The internal banking system of the empire, already burdened by the trans-Siberian expenditures, reached its operational ceiling as domestic depositors began a quiet run on specie, fearing a suspension of the currency's convertibility. This internal capital flight further eroded the metallic cover of the ruble, forcing the state bank to engage in desperate currency interventions that consumed the remaining flexible assets of the treasury. By mid-1905, the structural collapse of Russian credit was absolute. The state found itself unable to float a major international loan on any terms, as the boycott in New York and London was now reinforced by a spontaneous withdrawal of French and German retail investors. The fall of the fortress proved that an empire's financial machinery could not function without the psychological guarantee of victory. For the Romanovs, the military defeat at the Pacific Gateway acted as a fiscal guillotine, terminating their access to global capital and leaving the autocracy to face its internal revolutionary liabilities without the protection of international credit. Following the Battle of Mukden in March 1905, the Imperial Japanese government required an unprecedented infusion of capital to sustain its continental momentum and prepare for the final naval showdown. Jacob Schiff responded by orchestrating the fourth and largest Japanese war loan, historically identified as the 4.5% solution. This issuance, totaling $30 million, was split equally between the London and New York syndicates, representing the highest volume of credit ever extended to a non-Western belligerent during an active conflict. The interest rate of 4.5% was significantly lower than the 6% coupon demanded in 1904, serving as a technical indicator that Japan's sovereign risk had been reclassified from a speculative gamble to a stabilized, winning investment. The bond was secured by a first charge on the imperial tobacco monopoly, creating a new layer of locked collateral that operated independently of the previously pledged customs receipts. This transaction functioned as a definitive signal of royal intolerance from the world's primary capital controllers toward the House of Romanov. By offering Japan superior credit terms, at the precise moment Russia was being frozen out of the Berlin and Paris markets, Schiff demonstrated that the financial machinery of the West had officially sanctioned Japan as the primary regional power. The loan was oversubscribed by 5 times in New York and 10 times in London, demonstrating that the Schiff-led Axis had successfully socialized the risk of a Russian collapse across the global retail investor base. This capital influx ensured that Japan remained liquid during the critical months preceding the Tsushima engagement. Conversely, the success of the 4.5% loan acted as a fiscal psychological operation, informing the Tsarist finance ministry that the international liquidity wall was now a permanent barrier. Schiff had effectively institutionalized the bankruptcy of the Romanov state through the mechanics of a lower interest rate, proving that yield could be used as a diplomatic weapon. Schiff recognized that the internal destabilization of the Russian Empire was a necessary complement to Japan's external military pressure, leading him to direct capital toward revolutionary organizations like the Socialist Revolutionaries, and the General Jewish Bund. This funding was a strategic investment in administrative facilitators intended to manage a post-Tsarist state that would adhere to international legal and financial norms. A primary mechanism for this subversion was the systematic radicalization of the 70,000 Russian prisoners of war held in Japanese camps following the Battle of Mukden and the Siege of Port Arthur. Schiff coordinated with figures like Dr. Nicholas Russell to distribute tens of thousands of pamphlets and revolutionary newspapers among these captives, ensuring their return to the interior as radicalized agents of political change. The Society of Friends of Russian Freedom, bolstered by Schiff's New York-based capital, provided the institutional shell for this ideological warfare. By capitalizing the domestic opposition, Schiff forced the Tsarist Ministry of the Interior to redirect diminishing liquid assets toward massive secret police operations and the Okhrana, further depleting the imperial war chest. This clandestine support transformed the 1905 unrest into a systemic crisis of authority, weaponizing the third estate of Russian radicalism as a non-military asset. The objective was to ensure that even if the Russian army remained physically operational, its internal command would be severed by the coordinated strikes and mutinies funded by Western high finance. Schiff's revolutionary interest effectively ensured that the Romanovs faced a dual-front war, a high-intensity naval conflict in the Pacific and a well-funded low-intensity insurgency at home. By the time of the Bloody Sunday Massacre, this investment had rendered the autocracy ungovernable, proving that the strategic provision of resources to dissidents could be as lethal as the provision of bullion to a foreign military. By the autumn of 1905, the ruble had transitioned from a gold-pegged instrument of imperial prestige to a defunct medium of exchange. The monetary framework established by Sergei Vita in 1897 was predicated on a strict bullion backing for the first 600 million rubles in circulation, a mandate that was systematically abandoned to fund a daily war expenditure exceeding 6 million rubles. As the state bank's balance sheet became saturated with unbacked credit notes, the legal convertibility of paper currency reached a point of functional expiration. This loss of fiscal integrity triggered a massive domestic flight into hard assets, with urban commercial houses and the middle class initiating a series of aggressive bank runs in the empire's financial centers. The October general strike exacerbated this crisis by severing the tax collection arteries, resulting in a total clearinghouse paralysis, where the state could no longer settle internal debts or fulfill its role as a lender of last resort. Foreign suppliers, observing the evaporation of the state bank's metallic ratio, began rejecting the ruble for the procurement of essential industrial components and maritime insurance. This currency humiliation resulted in a structural contraction of the domestic economy, as the ruble's purchasing power on the Paris and Berlin bourses entered a terminal descent. The state bank was forced to engage in emergency sterilization of the money supply, withdrawing currency from circulation to halt the onset of hyperinflation, a move that only deepened the agrarian credit famine. The ruble's exclusion from the international settlement system ensured that the Romanovs remained monetarily isolated, even as the physical conflict subsided. The Royal Mint's inability to guarantee the ruble's value signaled a definitive loss of sovereign control over the national economy. By December 1905, the ruble had become a vestigial asset, proving that the destruction of a currency's credibility was a more potent engine of political collapse than the loss of territory. The Battle of Tsushima in May 1905 served as the terminal event for the Russian Empire's fiscal solvency, transforming the state's remaining war bonds into effectively valueless paper. The total destruction of the Second Pacific Squadron by the Imperial Japanese Navy liquidated the physical maritime collateral that had justified the continued, albeit strained, support of French and Dutch creditors. This military catastrophe triggered an immediate vertical collapse in the market price of Russian 1904 and 1905 bond issues across the European bourses, as the risk premium associated with a Romanov default reached mathematically insurmountable levels. for the retail investor in Paris. The annihilation of the fleet was the definitive signal that the fortress of gold could no longer protect the principal of their investments from the consequences of absolute defeat. This psychological and technical shock rendered the Tsar's treasury incapable of floating any further securities to sustain the mobilization. The secondary market for Russian debt transitioned from a state of volatility to a state of total illiquidity as buyers evaporated, and the yield to maturity on existing bonds surged to distressed debt percentages. The financial axis led by Jacob Schiff had already ensured that no new capital would arrive from the West. Now, the Tsushima effect ensured that even the previously loyal French banks began a frantic deleveraging of their Russian exposures. The state's creditworthiness had been physically sunk in the Korea Strait, leaving the ruble-denominated debt as a legacy of a defunct imperial strategy. Consequently, the Russian Finance Ministry was forced to acknowledge that its external financing was exhausted, leaving the empire without the bullion necessary to service its existing international obligations. The debt was no longer viewed as a sovereign promise, but as a toxic liability, a transformation that stripped the Tsar of his final administrative defense. By June 1905, the Romanov state existed in a condition of functional bankruptcy, proving that the destruction of a nation's military capital results in the immediate and total obsolescence of its financial capital. The peace negotiations at Portsmouth in the summer of 1905 signaled the transition of Jacob Schiff from a clandestine underwriter to a dominant merchant prince with the authority to dictate the terms of imperial recovery. While President Theodore Roosevelt acted as the formal mediator, Schiff maintained a parallel diplomatic presence, advising the Japanese delegation and monitoring the fiscal breaking point of the Russian representatives. The central tension of the conference involved the Japanese demand for a massive war indemnity, a payment intended to liquidate the debt Japan had accrued to the Kuhn Loeb Syndicate. Serge Witte, representing the Tsar, initially refused any payment, gambling that Russia's physical vastness could withstand further financial isolation. Schiff's intervention was decisive in resolving this deadlock by applying a final credit ceiling to both belligerents. He informed Takahashi and the Japanese leadership that Western capital would not support a continuation of the war solely to extract an indemnity, effectively capping Japan's military ambition at the limits of its current solvency. Simultaneously, Schiff ensured that the peace terms denied the Romanovs any hope of a victor's loan or immediate market rehabilitation. The resulting treaty was not merely a territorial settlement, but a fiscal surrender. Russia was forced to cede the Liaodong Peninsula and the half of Sakhalin without receiving the cash influx necessary to repair its hollowed-out treasury. This outcome ensured that the post-war Russian state remained a prisoner of the international financial system. By preventing a massive cash transfer to Tokyo, Schiff forced the Tsar to face his internal revolutionary liabilities without the cushion of a stabilized ruble. The peace established a new administrative precedent. Russia's fiscal autonomy was permanently compromised, as any future stabilization loans from Paris or London were now contingent on the adoption of the procedural safeguards Schiff had long demanded. The Treaty of Portsmouth proved that the merchant prince could successfully conclude a war by controlling the exit price of imperial sovereignty. The conclusion of the Portsmouth negotiations left the Meiji state in a condition of victorious exhaustion, possessing the prestige of a first-tier military power, but burdened by a total war expenditure of 1.7 billion yen. Because the treaty failed to secure a Russian indemnity, Japan's internal fiscal machinery was forced to pivot from mobilization to the intensive management of its massive external debt. This obligation, totaling approximately $82 million in foreign loans, effectively transformed Japan into a permanent debtor nation to the New York-London financial axis. Jacob Schiff and Kuhn, Loeb, and Koser emerged from the conflict not merely as underwriters, but as the de facto sovereign creditors of the Japanese empire, establishing a symbiotic relationship that redefined the mechanics of global influence. This debt structure shifted the global axis of power, signaling the transition of New York from a domestic market into the world's emerging clearinghouse for sovereign risk. Japan's continued industrialization and the maintenance of its new territories in Korea and Manchuria were now contingent on the periodic refinancing of its wartime bonds into long-term development capital provided by Wall Street. This fiscal dependency ensured that Japan's strategic objectives remained aligned with the interests of the Anglo-American financial elite. The Japanese miracle was thus underwritten by a continuous flow of Western specie, creating a managed dependency where the Meiji government functioned as a regional administrative facilitator for Western capital. Consequently, the traditional European hegemony over sovereign lending was permanently fractured. The relationship established between Schiff and Takahashi during the conflict evolved into a permanent institutional link, where the survival of the Japanese economy was a mandatory requirement for the stability of New York's international portfolios. By 1906, the fiscal reality of the post-war era proved that Japan had traded its military autonomy for a seat at the table of the gold standard, overseen by the merchant princes of Wall Street. The terminal phase of the fiscal crisis manifested in the 1905 revolution, an uprising fundamentally catalyzed by the state's attempt to transfer the costs of the Pacific defeat onto its domestic labor and agrarian classes. The cessation of international credit forced the Romanovs into an aggressive extraction of arrears, a process that radicalized the urban proletariat whose real wages were being decimated by the ruble's devaluation. This was not merely a political revolt, but a systemic rejection of the Tsar's role as the primary debtor. The October general strike functioned as a national economic blockade, paralyzing the state's ability to circulate currency and effectively terminating the flow of tax revenue into the central treasury. Technical concessions, such as the October Manifesto and the establishment of the State Duma, were structurally designed as investor safeguards. The French banks, led by the Rothschilds, signaled that further stabilization loans were contingent on the creation of a representative body capable of validating the imperial budget. This transformed the Duma into a de facto budgetary oversight committee, intended to provide the legal transparency required to resume the flow of continental specie. Consequently, the political reorganization of the empire was dictated by the necessity of restoring sovereign credit rather than a genuine shift toward democratic governance. The internal collapse was characterized by the Soviet movement's attempt to issue its own alternative credit and tax systems, challenging the state's monopoly on fiscal management. By late 1905, the autocracy was forced to mobilize the army, paid for by emergency French credits, to suppress the very population it was taxing to service those same loans. The 1905 revolution proved that a bankrupt state could only maintain its administrative existence through a cycle of high-interest borrowing for the sole purpose of internal pacification, a structural trap that Schiff had accurately predicted. In 1906, Jacob Schiff traveled to Tokyo, marking the first time a Western private financier was received with the protocol typically reserved for heads of state. This visit functioned as the formal consolidation of the New York-Tokyo alliance, moving the relationship beyond the clandestine underwriting of the previous 2 years. The diplomatic climax occurred during a personal audience with the Meiji Emperor, a rare breach of traditional court etiquette for a foreign civilian. During this encounter, Schiff was invested with the First-Class Order of the Rising Sun, a distinction that established a historical precedent as the first time such an honor was conferred upon a foreigner of his rank and profession. The decoration served as an official imperial acknowledgement that the provision of international liquidity was functionally equivalent to the successful execution of naval or land campaigns. By awarding Schiff the first-class insignia, the Japanese government recognized the Kun, Loeb Syndicate, as a vital component of the state's defensive architecture, crediting the merchant prince with the preservation of Japanese sovereignty during the terminal liquidity crisis of 1904. This act of statecraft transformed the merchant prince into an institutional facilitator of national independence, proving that the control of transnational credit was a modern prerequisite for imperial survival. This formal bond ensured that the American capital market became the primary guarantor of Japan's post-war reconstruction and its administrative expansion into the Asian mainland. The Order of the Rising Sun symbolized the birth of a new Pacific Atlantic financial axis, where the strategic interests of the Wall Street elite were inextricably linked to the stability of the Japanese throne. Schiff's elevation to this status signaled the end of the traditional European monopoly on sovereign honors, confirming that the ability to mobilize specie in New York was now the most decisive factor in the maintenance of global political legitimacy. The 1906 stabilization loan, historically termed the Big Loan, codified Russia's transition into a supervised economy. This $90 million international issue was contingent on the Tsar's formal acceptance of the budgetary law, which mandated that all future military expenditures and state debts be ratified by the State Duma. This procedural safeguard terminated the autocracy's era of unilateral fiscal management, tethering the Romanovs to a multinational committee of lenders. The Great Syndicate of French and British banks enforced a regime of technical audits that monitored the ruble's metallic cover with forensic intensity, effectively turning the Russian finance ministry into a subsidiary of the Paris and London clearinghouses. For Wall Street, Schiff's successful financing of a non-Western belligerent established the intellectual precedent for the International Investment Bank as a specialized instrument of American statecraft. Kuhn, Loeb, and Kausser demonstrated that private capital could orchestrate the rise and fall of empires without the direct intervention of the U.S. Treasury, shifting the global center of gravity from the City of London to the New York Bourse. This administrative model replaced the traditional, opaque merchant house with a syndicated underwriting group that became the standard for 20th century corporate finance. The coordination of transnational specie movements during the conflict provided the technical blueprint for the subsequent architecture of the Federal Reserve System, specifically in the management of foreign exchange and gold reserves. Schiff's intervention proved that the control of credit networks was a more decisive factor in imperial longevity than the possession of territory. The Schiff Doctrine institutionalized the use of financial exclusion as a primary tool of diplomatic pressure, defining the modern era of economic sanctions. By 1907, the global hierarchy had been reorganized. Russia was a monitored debtor, Japan was a subsidized client, and New York was the world's new indispensable creditor. The merchant prince had successfully redefined the nature of sovereign legitimacy through the cold application of capital. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.